Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. Appreciate you joining me here for another week of this podcast. Before I get into today's topic, I just want to get you to take some time, please, to make sure you are subscribed on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. We are on all the podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, Google, Overcast, Spreaker, all of them. So make sure you subscribe, because by you subscribing, it gets us out there in front of more people. Also, share it around with anybody who you think might get some benefit out of what it is that I am doing here each week. You can also follow us on the socials, so the Unstoppable Dad Project on Facebook, at the Unstoppable Dad on Instagram. We've also got TikTok, and we have a YouTube channel where you'll be able to find the video versions of these podcasts, albeit delayed. The number one thing that I focus on each week, even if I run out of time to do anything else, is that I will drop a weekly podcast, or mostly weekly podcast. Some weeks I decide to take a week off because I'd like to spend that time with the family, or I might have a special occasion. Do have a special occasion coming up. So on the week of the 17th, so that is St. Patrick's Day, it is actually the day after my 40th birthday. So giving you a bit of pre-warning, in 2 weeks' time, there won't be an episode that week. There will be one next week, and then I'll have a week off, and then we'll be back to it after that. But pretty much every week, and it is the podcast that is the major focus. So by you being subscribed, as soon as I publish a new episode, you'll be notified, and that way you can go ahead and you can listen to the 15-20 minute episode that I drop on Saturday mornings, Australian time, each week. So this week, I want to get back to talking about training, and really just broad concepts around training. So for me, there are three concepts that determine the success of a training program. Now, when I talk about concepts, I don't actually talk about methods. So the difference between concepts and methods are what you would use to deliver the program. So sets and reps, exercises, things like that. So there are a lot of different methods you can use. It's even the type of training. And methods are going to be dependent on the goal, right? So it's going to be the exercises that you do, the type of exercise that you do, the frequency at which you do it. It's all going to be dependent on the goal. What a concept is it's almost like an overarching law that goes into each training program that I do in order to make sure that people are going to progress. So if one of these things is missing, it's not that progress can't happen, but it will be very unusual for progress to happen. So these are basically the three things that I feel you need to make sure that you are doing, or if you are hiring a coach or you are following a program, you need to make sure that are part of your program. So I think it was just important for me to cover off on this. It's something that I have probably spoken about at different periods on the podcast over the last couple of years, but today I'm going to go through those three concepts that are going to determine success with any training program. So it doesn't matter what methods are going to be used. These concepts are almost universal things that I've observed, and that other people that I have learnt from, that I listen to, that I gain my education from, will most likely agree with are needed in order for you to have any training program and progress in any training program. And the number one thing, and this is pretty much in order, right? Like, this isn't a list where there's no, it doesn't matter what order you take these in. I actually feel like this is in order. So you actually need to, like, the number one thing and the number one concept that you need to, it's adherence. So making sure that you do the program. Adherence and consistency trumps everything. You would have heard me say that so many times on this podcast that I'm going to sound like a broken record. But without adherence and without doing the work, like, you're not going to get anywhere. It can be the most well-written program on the face of God's green earth, and you will get absolutely no results if you don't stick to it. It's really that simple. And Again, a lot of this is a concept. This isn't a method. The method is going to come back to the goals. So adherence, whether it's going to be 2 times a week or 3 times a week, if you are sticking to that over the long term, then you will get some form of results. Like, that will trump everything, especially if you are a beginner or if you are somebody who hasn't trained for a while. If you haven't trained for a while, the biggest thing that is going to help you get back into something and start to see results. So if you're looking to get back into strength training and get your strength back and work on actually becoming stronger and more athletic as a dad, as a husband, as a father, really just sticking to what that should be the number one focus. There shouldn't be anything over and above that. You want to adhere to what you are doing. You want to make sure you are consistently taking that action and you are consistently doing what is set out for you, because that is going to be the number one thing, the number one concept that is going to make sure that you succeed with your training program. Now, number two is progressive overload. So what I mean by that is that we are constantly increasing the stimulus in order to elicit a response from our body. So if we take strength training as an example, there are actually a lot of different ways that you can progressively overload something. But it could be as simple as increasing the sets and reps, so increasing the overall amount of work that you're doing. It could also be something like increasing the weight, a really common beginner program that is used that uses progressive overload as the starting strength program, which is the 3x5 or a 5x5 on compound movements, so back squat, deadlifts, bench press, and what you do is you add like a kilo and a half, 2 kilos every time you do the movement. So essentially, you do 5 sets of 5 at the same weight, and then the next you might back squat on day 1, you might bench press on day 2 and deadlift on day 3, for example, and then each week you are doing 5x5 at the same weight, and then the next week you're adding a little bit more, and then the next week you're adding a little bit more, but you're still doing that 5x5 rep range. That is progressive overload as a concept, where you're slowly adding a little bit more. Now, the thing with progressive overload, there are a couple of things that need to work inside of that. Number one, it needs to be consistent. So there needs to be this consistent ramping up of the stimulus. So it might be adding an extra rep every week or every 2 weeks. It might be adding a little bit of weight as per something like starting strength. It may be some other way of progressively overload. These are just some really simple ways, some really simple methods to stick to this particular concept. So it needs to be consistent and it needs to be predictable. So we need to understand where we are going with it, and we need to know the formula. It needs to not be random. So you're not just going to add 3 reps one week and 2 reps the next, and then we need to be consistently moving it forward. The other thing with progressive overload, and this is I think a common thing where it can go haywire, is overload without pushing you to a breaking point. So it's a little bit of stress to progress, but it's not stressing to break you. And that's a really important thing to understand, especially for beginners or especially for somebody who's looking to get back into training. Again, another thing that I've spoken about before is we don't want to push you to the point. If we're getting back, let's say we're getting back into strength training, we don't want to push you to the point where you're unable to walk for 2 weeks afterwards. There is potentially going to be some form of soreness, but soreness isn't an indicator of success for any program, and you shouldn't be using it as one. What should be an indicator of success, especially with something like progressive overload, is the overall trend of what we're doing and what we're aiming to achieve moving up. So if we are looking to get stronger and we are using, say, barbell movements as an indicator and as a metric of our success, is the weight on the bar moving overall in an upward trajectory? And there's another rabbit hole I can go down where I can talk about like more advanced training where the progress isn't necessarily going to be linear. You're going to have ebbs and flows and peaks and troughs, so it's going to go up and it's going to come down. But what I'm talking about is over a long period, a 6-month, 12-month period, is the overall trend moving in an upwards direction? Like, are we progressively overloading to a point where we're actually gaining traction and we're moving in the direction we want to? Because that's the big thing, and that's progressive overload as a concept. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be predictable, but it also needs to be done in a way where it's not pushing you to a breaking point, because if it pushes you to a breaking point, then that's going to affect the first concept, which is adherence. Okay, and see, this is why they're in order, because if you don't stick to what you're doing, there's no point in worrying about progressive overload, because we're not going to get anywhere with it because we're not doing the work. For progressive overload, if we don't do that the right way, that can hinder adherence. Okay, so they're the first two. Adherence and progressive overload are those first two things. And the third thing is individualization. And individualization isn't just necessarily about you getting a program or something that is written specifically for you. It can be, but it can be things like, what elements of the session do we need to tailor in order for you to get enjoyment out of the session? Because again, enjoyment is going to feed into adherence. If you enjoy something that you're doing, you're going to be more likely to stick to it and more likely to continue to come back. It's also going to be things like equipment limitations, movement limitations, like what can we do without putting you in pain? What do we need to do in order to get you to move better? Like, these things matter. Specificity around that, around your individual set of goals. And as I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, the methods that we use in order to deliver these concepts will change, because it's going to change around your goals, which comes back to the individualization piece and the specificity. Now, I actually don't necessarily think that this is as important as the first two, hence why it's the third thing on the list and not the first or second. Because again, if we can't get you to adhere to what you're doing and show up and do the work, it doesn't matter how fantastic the program is or how tailored to your particular set of circumstances the program is going to be. You are just not going to get results. And that's what these three concepts are about. These three concepts are about what needs to go into your training program and the methods of which you're doing in order to get results. And if you're not doing these three things, like, you're just not going to get results. And the number one thing is showing up. It's adherence. And then from there, we need to make sure we're constantly stressing that system to a point where we're constantly progressing. And that's a concept that I've gone through when I've talked about, say, injury rehab, making sure we're constantly just edging a little bit more work and a little bit more work in order to make the system stronger. Like, that stress to progress, we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep adding a little bit more. And then taking into consideration the individual set of circumstances. And that is not just sets and reps. It can be equipment limitations, it can be movement limitations, but it can also center around your enjoyment of whatever it is that you're doing. You might not be a gym person. You might not be somebody who wants to go to the gym and be around a lot of people due to whatever factor that is, whether it causes you anxiety, or maybe it's just not something you enjoy. But going and playing touch footy on the weekend, going and doing something like jiu-jitsu, like a sport like jiu-jitsu, if you stick to it, it actually has like progressive overload built into the way you learn and the way you take in skills. Like, as you become more advanced and your knowledge around what you are doing grows, it almost has that progressive overload built in where you are going to learn and be able to perform more advanced skills. That in itself is progressive overload, because you're not going to be able to do certain things until you have that requisite knowledge or understanding of the basics that layer in underneath it. That's another way of progressive overload. That is not just sets and reps and weights on the bar. And individualization for something like that, like you're going to individualize your own game based off your body type, based off your lever lengths, based off things that you just get like drawn to in the journey that you do it. And that happens over time. And that's the same with a weights training program. But you might enjoy doing that more than doing something else. Now, I'm obviously a big advocate of making sure that everyone is doing some form of structured weight training, because I think especially as we get older, regardless of what we're doing, especially if we're a dad or an older man that wants to partake in recreational sport, doing the training on the outside will help us be able to perform better and do more of what we want to do longer. And for a lot of people that I've worked with and spoken to, that's the missing part. What we do is we jump into these activities and then we're constantly injured, we're constantly hurt, we're constantly battling these things which can suck the enjoyment out of the thing that we really want to do. And if we just maybe took a little bit of time away from that and invested it into body work and making sure that was our joints and our ligaments and our muscles are staying strong in order to handle the stress of that activity, then we're going to be held in better stead and able to actually get back to concept one of adherence to that thing we want to do more, which can then feed into the progressive overload, which then also feeds into the individualization and that enjoyment piece that ties into it. So I do think strength training is very important regardless of what you want to do. And I also think it's super important, especially if you are a recreational sport person. And something like jiu-jitsu, something like playing touch footy on the weekend, yes, that is activity, and yes, that is getting out and is so important for you. But working into your life another way, some form of structured strength training is going to be a very, very important thing as we get older, because the body's just not going to stay together as well once we put more wear and tear and more mileage on it. And we need to make sure we're doing the appropriate maintenance to continue to do exactly what we love to do. Anyway, back to today's topic and to wrap this up. So the three concepts that you need to make sure that you look at to determine the success of your training program. Number one is adherence. It trumps everything. Consistency is key. You need to make sure that you are sticking to what you said you were going to do. If you don't have that, nothing else matters. Adherence is number one. Number two is progressive overload. Whatever it is that you are doing, making sure that there is a consistent, predictable way that you are continually challenging yourself past what your previous threshold was without pushing you to breaking point. And number three is the individualization. So making sure that you enjoy what you're doing, making sure that any equipment, movement limitations are addressed through the specificity of the training that needs to be addressed based off your individual goals, wants, and needs. So they are those three concepts. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you're doing something that you feel addresses all those issues. I reckon that's awesome if you are. I think it's very important for us as men to make sure we are doing something physical and we are also doing something to keep our bones, muscles, joints, and minds healthy, because my personal opinion is the body feeds the mind. If we are doing something to keep ourselves and our bodies healthy, looking good, looking fit, and feeling well, then sometimes that can help with those mental struggles that we experience as dads and fathers. So thanks for listening this week. I appreciate your time. I will see you for next week's episode, and have a stellar week. Goodbye.